finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
This week, May and I have the awesome privilege of interviewing Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough is a cardiologist in Dallas, Texas, and an academic, as well as an epidemiologist. He has over 1,000 publications and 500 citations in the National Library of Medicine. He has since turned his scholarship in the last year to all things COVID and specifically early treatment of COVID. He has testified before the State Senate of Texas and before the United States Senate with regards to COVID treatment and handling of the pandemic. It has been a true honor, privilege, and really humbling to be able to listen to his knowledge and taste his passion for patient care. This is going to be a great couple episodes. But first, we have a word from one of our colleagues in the Doctor Podcast Network, Dr. Erin Weissman, to tell us about her podcast.
Hey there, this is Dr. Erin Weissman. I'm a fellow Doctor Podcast Network member, life coach, and mama 3. I kick butt, I take names, and I help other high-achieving people do the exact same. And today, I want to invite you over to my podcast, Dr. Me First. It's well over 300 episodes, and each one is filled with inspiration and advice from amazing guests. So grab your wife, your mom, your sister, your best friend, and come tune in as we explore what it means to be a woman in medicine and a woman in this world. Because this podcast is a dose of everything that I needed when I was burned out, exhausted, and ready to quit it all. At the end of the day, I do this to help you feel more connected to yourself and to connect with others. I love to end my show with a kick of encouragement, so here's my favorite tagline. Your life, your calling, your pulse matters. See you over at Dr. Me First.
All right. Welcome, Dr. McCullough. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Well, thanks for having me on the program. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm a professor of medicine at Texas A&M College of Medicine and the Dallas campus. I'm board certified in internal medicine cardiology. I am an epidemiologist. I trained in epidemiology at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And my focus has really been on the interface between heart and kidney disease my entire career until COVID-19 hit. And I redirected all my efforts to focus on COVID-19 as an epidemiologist and internist because it was taking such a large toll in my entire circle, including family, friends, my hospital and clinic practice. And so, like many of us, COVID-19 became a hyper-dominant issue in my life, and I felt it was worth all the efforts to focus my scholarship on COVID-19.
So you were the lead author on a paper about the early treatment of COVID-19, early outpatient treatment, and May and I are outpatient doctors, so we're especially interested in this. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Early in the spring, I became frustrated with what I saw on TV. We seemed to adopt a defensive posture of all the news was about personal protective equipment and hospitalizing patients and then wearing masks and social distancing and lockdown. And I made the observation that no one is addressing the problem. The problem is patients are getting very sick and being hospitalized and dying. So hospitalization and death are a severe problem with COVID-19 that I set out to put together teams of doctors to address the problem and stop these hospitalizations and death. I thought that was a critical, courageous statement of a medical leader, and I set about to do that. Of interest, there was no medical leader. There was no leader overall, no president, no vice president, no White House task force, no CDC, FDA, World Health Organization. There was no leader that actually made the courageous statement. And what I've said is, listen, if our president can't recognize that hospitalization and death are a bad problem, he's going to put a stop to it. If he can't frame the problem, he's certainly not going to be able to solve it. And so I stepped up and did it.
So tell us a little bit about the treatment protocol, because I know there's been a lot of debate about this. In our state, the Board of Pharmacy actually stepped in. If we were going to write a prescription for hydroxychloroquine that wasn't for a FDA indication, like a rheumatoid disease or something like that, we were blocked. I mean, we were blocked at the state level from being able to prescribe it off-label.
There was a great need to have papers published in the peer-reviewed literature in medical journals cited by the National Library of Medicine. That means they were completely vetted in terms of their scientific rationale and basis. And the very first paper published that taught doctors how to treat COVID-19, the title of the paper was The Pathophysiologic Rationale for Early Ambulatory Treatment of COVID-19. It was published in August 2020 in the American Journal of Medicine. It's the most cited and downloaded paper for the American Journal of Medicine now for going on nearly a year. The follow-up paper, which was needed because we had new drugs, we had ivermectin, we had monoclonal antibodies, colchicine, that was published in a dedicated COVID-19 issue of Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine, of which I'm the editor of that journal, but we had a special issue editor, not me, obviously. It went through the peer review process. It was heavily vetted, and that paper had 57 authors. It had really the nation's leading treating doctors on COVID-19. It was published in the December 2020 issue, and that is the most frequently downloaded and cited paper for that journal now. So the worldwide recognition on these papers in a confused literature, there's now 100,000 papers on COVID-19, all describing different parts of the illness, but none of them put the patient first and said hospitalization and death are important. Let's stop it. And that was the goal of these papers. So what's the protocol? The protocol recognizes there's three major dimensions to the illness: viral replication, cytokine storm, and thrombosis or blood clotting. Three elements. So that would tell the listener right away it's not treatable with a single drug. No single drug is going to work. So when the early studies came out and said, aha, this drug doesn't work, and that drug doesn't work, it's just like with AIDS. Single drugs don't work with HIV. What we looked for was signals of benefit and acceptable safety in the literature, and then assembling them into regimens. Turns out there's many ways to treat COVID-19, and there are varieties of combinations of drugs that work. In general, it takes about 4 to 6 drugs, in addition to nutraceuticals and supplements, to treat a high-risk patient with COVID-19 with the goal of reducing the intensity and duration of symptoms and reducing hospitalizations and death. In brief, patients over age 50 or with medical problems or younger people who are presenting with severe symptoms, they would need to be treated with this type of approach. It means roughly 25% of a primary care practice who develop COVID-19 should get treatment. 75% of people do not need treatment. They can get through this. This is a mild, self-limited viral illness. But the risk stratification is really important, and age really matters. I can tell you, I'm a cardiologist. My patients in general are over age 65. Patients with heart disease and lung disease for sure need treatment. It is too risky to not treat them and have them go for 2 weeks at home until they can't breathe anymore and then succumb to hospitalization and death. I think that's immoral, unethical, and I think it's illegal for medical professionals to do that, to advise no treatment in a fatal condition. That's what we call failure to treat. And I think there'll be some days of reckoning for individuals in the future. The treatment protocol involves nutraceuticals, which are helpful because we know deficiencies increase mortality and complications. The nutraceuticals I do not think are curative. Very importantly, they're helpful. Zinc, 50 milligrams of elemental zinc a day. Vitamin D3, 3,000 international units or more. Vitamin C, 300 milligrams or more. Quercetin or quercetin, 500 milligrams twice a day. That's a bundle. Some have said, listen, add lysine to it, add other things to it. Okay, that's fine. I wouldn't, it's a tough illness. I wouldn't argue with any of that. And that's the reason why naturopathic and homeopathic physicians and others have gotten involved, because the nutraceuticals probably do play a role, but I don't think they're curative. If we can get an antibody infusion in the United States, we can now, the only antibody infusion available is the Regeneron combination of Carazivimab and Indimavab. These are monoclonal antibodies that we can infuse over an hour, observe for another hour, and then have the patient go home. If we can do that in an urgent care center, there are chains of urgent cares on the East Coast that are doing this wonderfully, and I've talked to doctors doing that. In my location in Dallas, we do that with a phone call to the ER. The patients go into an isolated room, get the infusion, go home. Terrific. These are approved by the FDA under the Emergency Use Authorization Act. After that, we use 2 or more intracellular anti-infectives to reduce viral replication. They can include hydroxychloroquine that you mentioned, or ivermectin, or outside the United States, favipiravir, which is an oral direct polymerase inhibitor. Interestingly, favipiravir, of those 3, is the only one that has regulatory approval to treat COVID-19. So it's approved by the regulatory agencies in 5 countries, widely used in many countries, to directly treat COVID-19. Favipiravir has not seen the light of day in North America, and in my view, that's been a mistake not to do that. We add doxycycline or azithromycin for 2 reasons. There is about a 2 to 3% overlap with mycoplasma and chlamydia pneumonia in these patients with coronavirus, and also because they tend to reduce slightly viral replication, and they cover superinfection in the sinuses and the tracheobronchial tree. So that's the reason why that combination. So a common one would be hydroxy and azithro, hydroxy, doxy, ivermectin, plus doxy or azithro. And there's various dosing schemes, and I won't give you more on that right now. Then we move into inhaled steroids, which can be used all the way through. Inhaled budesonide, 800 micrograms cumulatively in a day. Randomized trial shows over an 80% reduction in ER and hospitalization visits. The STOIC trial, very well supported. Day 5 or pulmonary symptoms, we can add oral steroids. Meta-analysis published in JAMA. Steroids reduce mortality by about 30%. It doesn't matter if it's prednisone or dexamethasone or hydrocortisone. I personally think prednisone is fine. We use it all the time in primary care. 40 milligrams a day, 5 days, no taper, that's fine. We know that colchicine now in the Corona trial had a large reduction in mortality and death, over 4,000 patients, double-blind randomized trial, colchicine, 0.6 milligrams twice a day for 3 days. Continue it for 30 days thereafter. So we've already handled viral replication, cytokine storm. Last thing we need to handle is blood clotting or thrombosis. Aspirin 325 milligrams a day throughout the infection. In high-risk patients, my preference is to add low-molecular weight heparin or an oral novel anticoagulant. That may sound like a lot to your listener, but listen, this is a serious infection. We've had 590,000 Americans die. We've had millions of hospitalizations. Many of the things I talked about, we use in the hospital anyway. My approach is, let's make the home the place of treatment so we can reduce spread and reduce risk of hospitalization and death.
So, wow, okay. So here we are. Tim and I we started covering this right from the beginning when COVID came out, and then there was talk of hydroxychloroquine, which got pushed and almost laughed at by our previous president, mocked. There is the CDC recommendations. We have people and physicians who are respected and who say, follow the science. There's not good data of what, is out there. They mock the hydroxychloroquine or even the ivermectin. People talk about the supplements. Might not hurt. I guess my thing is now where we're at, there's all this published data, yet there's like a disconnect. You're talking about on the East Coast, even urgent care centers are doing these multi-drug treatments for patients with COVID as outpatients. We're in a setting on the West Coast where we work in a location that still holds fast and true to what the CDC says. They don't want to budge. And we in Oregon, at least, aren't even allowed to prescribe hydroxychloroquine if someone doesn't fit their criteria for rheumatologic conditions. We're just blocked. I guess, for the listeners that aren't medical, but even other physicians wanting to know, like, what the heck is going on? I mean, there's so much published data now, yet there's this still disconnect between, a lot of this still seems to be labeled not voodoo medicine, but there's no, follow the science. There's no science. It's mind-boggling that we're still at this place where it's not accepted.
Well, but the throwback that you hear from some of the regular, the talking heads on TV is there's no randomized controlled trial. Like all of a sudden, randomized controlled trials are the greatest thing in the world, and everything in medicine is based on a randomized controlled trial. Well, if you've ever seen an actual patient, very little of what we do that's still very effective and the standard of care is not backed up by a randomized controlled trial. I mean, methylphenidate wasn't even studied in a randomized trial and was approved for ADD. Yeah. So, I mean, this stuff goes on all the time. And so, and then the goalposts keep getting moved, and we're sitting here, we want to keep our jobs. We want to do best by the patients and by our employer. And it's just like, my goodness. I mean, the confusion and the frustration is really just epic.
Well, you can join the club because the confusion is equal in the hospital. keep this in mind that in the hospital, giant controversies over remdesivir. Does it work or not? Well, of course, by that time, the virus is not even replicating, so it makes sense that it's going to be controversial. Convalescent plasma, does it work or not? Controversial. Tocilizumab, controversial. There is just an enormous free-for-all because we don't have large, adequate randomized trials, and we're not going to. This virus takes 4 to 6 drugs. There is not a single trial even planned of using 4 to 6 drugs to treat. So we're 2 to 4 years away from the evidence base that would make all doctors feel comfortable all the time in treating the virus. Doctors in the hospital are equally as uncomfortable as you are in the outpatient clinic. It's equally as confusing. The difference between the hospital and the clinic is the hospital, the doctors have closed units. Every unit has infectious disease doctors who are working together, and they have a lot of intellectual support in what they're trying to do for the patient. In the outpatient world, we don't have any intellectual support. We're trying to make decisions. We're getting smoked with phone calls. I've got somebody I have to answer right after I talk with you guys who has it, and her husband has it. And we have to make decisions. And that's the reason why I felt so compelled that we have to address the outpatient space. Keep in mind the Infectious Disease Society of America, the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the FDA, none of them comprehensively address the outpatient with COVID-19. They don't. In fact, they kind of give glancing comments like, well, don't treat until they get in the hospital, or, warning against hydroxychloroquine, warning against ivermectin, warning against convalescent plasma. There's even confusing information about the monoclonal antibodies. And how I respond to that is saying, listen, the FDA and CDC are trying to do their best. They are general advice and regulatory. FDA is really a regulatory agency based on safety, so we want them to opine on safety, especially on new products. Established products, we understand them. Their opinion on safety on a 50-year-old drug is not too helpful because it's been around so long. But a brand new entity like a vaccine, boy, we want FDA guidance on an experimental vaccine for sure on safety. That's their main role, is safety. The CDC is not a treating organization. They're a public health organization, and they give general recommendations regarding smoking and diet and wearing seatbelts and stuff. But they are in no position to give doctors recommendations on how to treat an individual patient. It's up to the doctor. And even the NIH in their guidelines says that. The NIH is not a treating organization. In fact, they're a research organization. And even they say, in the end, it's up to the doctor. Ask your doctor. The doctor decides what to do. And so the difficult thing now with all this confusion and panic is the fact that doctors feel like they're at risk. If they try to help a patient, that they're at risk. And this is where things have really gone wrong. And it is striking to see this is a worldwide phenomenon. There are doctors with their hearts broken because they're encouraged to perform euthanasia in seniors in Scandinavia and Northern EU. There are doctors in the middle of Africa who are trying to help patients with ivermectin, and there's other senior doctors, administrators saying, no, you can't use ivermectin. There's been mercenary people who have raided pharmacies in Africa at night and burned all the hydroxychloroquine. There was a hydroxychloroquine plant outside of Taipei that was burned to the ground. I mean, there is such, in Australia, in Queensland, Australia, they published a law in April that said if a doctor tries to help a COVID patient and prescribe hydroxychloroquine, that doctor could be punished up to including 6 months in jail. Something has gone on that is such a strong worldwide signal to not touch this problem. Don't touch it. Don't treat it. Let the fear, suffering, and hospitalization and death go full force.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt, but I'm like, the whole goal is to keep people out of the hospital. The prime time to treat them is as outpatients when they're less sick. And to I don't understand it. I mean, even where we're here and where we live, the whole thing of, no, you can't prescribe hydroxychloroquine, they didn't go as far, I don't think, to say as they would take our license away, but it would, like, you could,
No, but they did take an Oregon doctor's license away because he didn't make everyone wear masks.
But I don't understand. Then of course it goes to the whole conspiracy theory, of course, of like, is they're wanting you to get sick, go in the hospital, and then it's to the vaccine. They want to push the vaccine instead of looking at treatments to prevent or to treat the COVID?
Well, the first comment is about kind of the will to treat in patients. The doctors have the fiduciary relationship to patients. We have the Hippocratic Oath. We went into medicine to help patients on a one-by-one basis. And I work for the patient. I don't work for the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, the media. I work for the patient. And when I testified in the U.S. Senate on November 19th, in my opening statement, I held up the protocol. And there were patients dying all over. The hospitals were flooded. And I told America, I said, listen, I am not asking permission to do this. I don't need permission granted for me to take care of sick patients. I said, I'm asking for your help. And it's either you're with me or you're not. And this is really about who is strongest, who has the greatest strength. And any person who wants to come up and say, you don't have enough data or you can't do this, what I say is, bring them on. Bring them on. And I have, when I first published the paper in the American Journal of Medicine, I got vitriolic letters that came in from Duke University, from Monash in Australia, from McGill in Montreal, from Brazil. And the general tone of the letter was, Dr. McCullough, you can't do this. You can't treat patients. And my response every time was, yes, I can, and I even have more supportive data. And here's how the drugs work together. And what I said is, I said, please join me in overcoming the fear. Please join me in overcoming the fear and overcoming therapeutic nihilism to help patients. Please join me. And I think so much of this has been driven out of fear, this groupthink. And I have to tell you, there are people today where I sense that this is a test of wills. This is a test of wills. Who's strongest? Who is strongest? I can tell you what the patients want. They want compassionate doctors to help them. We have the entire universe on our side. But the stakeholders that are against early treatment, as you implied, are strongly linked to promotion of mass vaccination.
So,
Do you think this is a generational thing as far as physicians go? I mean, this is a maybe really out there question. I know you're probably about our age, have been practicing. How many years have you been practicing?
I'm starting my fourth decade.
Yeah, so we're like getting close to 30 years. So I find it fascinating with the new and up and coming physicians, and not to just dump on them, but do you think it's more of a younger generational physician thing that seems to tend to, I don't know, do the group thing more than past generations?
There's clearly a division between independent doctors and employed doctors. It is of interest. We're 14 months into this. Where's the Harvard protocol?
Right.
Where's the Mayo Clinic protocol? Where's the Duke protocol? I mean, we have so much American ingenuity and firepower. I mean, they haven't treated a single patient. They haven't prevented a single hospitalization. These incredible institutions. Where's their COVID clinics? Where's their programs? It's like we're playing a Super Bowl, and these guys didn't even show up to the game. It's so interesting. And really, all these patients and the brilliance of these universities and the resources, they could have done the trials on their own budgets. They could have put together combinations of drugs. And it's almost as if they concluded nothing works and we're not even going to try.
well, right.
Or we're so scared of this, we don't want to touch this, we're not going to try. Maybe it was fear-driven, but it is clear Harvard never tried to help a single patient. Neither did Mayo Clinic. Now, if they had to admit them, they did. But they played defense. And keep in mind the media stream initially, what was it? What were we seeing early on? Personal protective equipment. Well, what's that about? That's about protecting the doctors and the nurses. That's not about helping patients.
No.
And then later on, the media cycle changed to wearing masks and social distancing and washing your hands. Well, that doesn't help sick patients. And then it changed now to mass vaccination. Well, that doesn't help sick patients. So the entire focus has actually been on well people. Throughout this entire pandemic, the focus has been on people without the illness. There hasn't been any focus on the illness. And when I testified in the Texas Senate, I literally just ripped the Department of Health and Human Services. I said, I listened to 6 hours of self-congratulatory testimony on everything else except for the sick patient. We've had, I think at the time, I forget how many deaths we had in Texas, 45,000 deaths. I said, we've got tens of thousands of people getting sick every day. Nobody has even talked about the sick patient. What about the patient journey? The patient gets sick. They go to an urgent care. That's the most likely place that the patient gets a diagnosis. They get their test result. You have COVID-19. What do? Go home.
Right. Yeah.
Is there any treatment? No. Is there any research I can get involved in? No. Do I do anything? No. Well, what happens? Well, when you get really, really sick and you can't breathe anymore, then go to the hospital.
Exactly.
These poor people go home. They go into a panic, and they get progressively sicker at home. Many of them call their doctors, and their doctor said, nope, I won't treat you. There are some medical groups that don't take COVID calls. That's their policy. They don't take any COVID calls. And they let the patients get progressively sick at home until the final panic. And at the final panic, relatives come over to try to help grandma. She infects everybody. She infects the Uber drivers, the paramedics, the clinic staff, and every patient hospitalized is a super spreader event. Can you imagine that that's been our pandemic response? No wonder we've done so terrible. I can't think of a worse way to manage an infectious disease pandemic.
When you say it like that, it just sounds so impotent and pathetic, and it's so embarrassing. But that's what we've done.
Right. What about the rest of the world? I mean, the place that always just blows my mind, and it's, back in the news, is India. If you look at deaths per million people, the United States is what, like 14 or 1,500 per million, and India throughout the last 12 months was like 140 in a country of over 1 billion people, ridiculous overcrowding, virtually zero infrastructure from a healthcare perspective, at least from a Western healthcare perspective, sanitation issues, et cetera, et cetera. And they were an order of magnitude less deaths per million people. Any thoughts on that?
It's so impossible to make country comparisons or even statewide comparisons or even citywide comparisons. Couple things. One, age really matters. So the age structure, some of these states in India, the median age is 28. I mean, you can't even talk about it. It's so different than other places. You go to the median age in Japan, and it's way different. The other thing is that the virus seems to move around in pockets of susceptibility. So when the virus is ravaging the United States, you don't hear much about India or Southeast Asia. When the virus kind of leaves the United States, now it's off somewhere else. When it was in Milan, we were watching it unfold, thinking it's going to get here. When it got to the United States, we watched New York, and it was like hell time in New York and military. And then we were thinking, what's going to happen in Dallas or Eugene or Portland? So the virus seems to move around to pockets of susceptibility. Age really matters. And it's just impossible to do these regional determinations. In Dallas, for instance, we had the parochial school systems. They never shut down the schools. They just had school all the way through. But the public school system did. And you're just like, well, how do you compare? Did it really? Look at Sweden. They never shut down anything. They just protected the seniors. So you couldn't have a more varied pandemic response. Obviously, there is no right way to do it. But I agree with your passions on this, that we need a heavy dose of common sense, and we need a heavy dose of humility. If it looks like things aren't working, we need to change. And one thing that was clear, if we don't treat before the hospital, we can't stop a hospitalization. There's no method by which the hospitalization is going to be prevented than to treat it. And this illness is like any other illness. It must be treated early. It has to. And that is so compelling. Anybody who says, oh, no, we can just wing it after 2 weeks and pick up the pieces and the hospitalization is crazy. The Stop COVID registry just published a contemporary mortality estimate. Those who require the ICU at 28 days, mortality 38%. Unacceptably high. Any person that tells me I can't treat a patient and I have to let patients get hospitalized and face that, I'll tell them forget it. It's about who's bigger, who's stronger, and who's more courageous. And I say, bring him on.
Yeah, I really feel like we're watching like a fire, and you know, you're not even allowed to like try to use a fire extinguisher or even a small hose. You just have to say, sorry, stand back and wait till maybe the fire truck comes and we'll get there. When we get there, if we get there, otherwise, too bad. Let the neighborhood burn.
I'm going to give you some insight. There's been way too much emphasis put on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin because people have said that, if we can knock down those two, then the whole house of cards fall. I spent 2 hours with a South African doctor, Dr. Chetty, Chetty. He's treated 4,000 patients down in a kind of smaller town in South Africa. He's had virtually no hospitalizations and deaths and tons of sick patients. He's had different waves. He's had groups of black Africans, white Africans, Indian Africans, and they come in waves. And he said hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin became so controversial. His basic treatments involve inhaled steroids, oral steroids, montelukast, aspirin, and anticoagulants. And I said, it looks like you haven't relied too much on the antivirals. He goes, no. He goes, a lot of times the patients present too late anyway, and they were too controversial. And I said, well, what percent of all the patients did you treat did you actually use ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine? He goes, about 10%. So that's my message. If the pharmacists are going to make the sword to die on hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, let it go. Give them some doxycycline. Go ahead and give them the nutraceuticals and move on to the inhaled steroids and anticoagulants. And that when I presented in the U.S. Senate, I held it up and I got to that step. I go, how can this be controversial? We would do this for an asthmatic.
Yeah.
We would treat bronchopneumonia. So I think if the primary care doctors can just get off this hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin thing, there is an analysis that's been accepted. Paul Alexander from Canada has a paper accepted where he reviewed all the nursing home studies. And some of the nursing home protocols, they just used doxycycline and nutraceuticals, and they moved into the steroids and Lovenox. It works fine. So you don't have to be so wedded to these flashpoints because you know what? The people are going to make a big deal out of it. We'll move on. There is so many ways to treat this virus. This virus is not hard to treat. Just the main thing is do something. Don't let a patient get nothing.
I love that point, how we get so focused on, especially the hydroxychloroquine, now the ivermectin. But you're right. In any other illness, we give people all these other supportive therapies, suggestions, even chicken soup. But you know what I mean? It's like we have so much in an armamentarium that you're naming that we could be using.
But that's the thing. It's that if you look at other branches of medicine, this is how I make these arguments to my colleagues that disagree with me. I'm like, I say, look, what would have happened if we would have treated HIV in the mid 80s and the early 90s like this? We would have just said, no, you got to wait. You have to wait till there's a vaccine. There's going to be a vaccine. You have to wait. Well, there's still no vaccine because, retroviruses are hard to make vaccines for. What did they do? They threw every kind of therapeutic cocktail in the martini shaker they could possibly get their hands on until they, figured out better and better drugs. I mean, this is exactly how we treated hepatitis C. I remember back in the mid-90s treating these patients with interferon and then pegylated interferon, and they were really, really sick, and the cure rates were like 40 to 60% if you were lucky, and you had to have a liver biopsy and all the rest of it. Now, I mean, it's an expensive prescription, but it's a prescription and it's darn near 80 or 90% curable, and it's an outpatient thing, and patients don't get sick.
Oh.
You know why? Because we threw all the stuff that worked a little bit in combination until we developed better drugs. Why aren't we doing that here?
You're on the right track. You're basically speaking to the merits of empiric therapy, and Ray Ascui and I published a paper on this demonstrating the parallelism to treating COVID-19. We both lived through the era of coronary stents. When coronary stents were initially put in, I'll never forget the protocol. The protocol was we were so terrified. In fact, there were cases where the stent clogged and the patient died. We were so terrified. We used aspirin, ticlopidine, dipyridamol, heparin, warfarin, and dextran.
Oh, God.
All together, we used 6 anticoagulants. And of course, we had bleeding all over the place, but we were terrified. And then we did clinical trial. And it took 15 years before we got it down to aspirin and Plavix. So the point is we start broad with a lot of drugs, we save the patient, and then we refine it down. And our approach to COVID-19 is no different. Do you think in a few years we'll get to 2 drugs? Sure. And will one of them be a new drug? Could it be a Merck drug or Pfizer drug? Fine, bring it on. I am not fighting any new drug. Oh, hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. Fine, I'll use something else. The bottom line is there is a group of stakeholders. They actually want no treatment. There are people who really want no treatment. They are against any and all treatment of COVID-19. And there's something going on that the world needs to know about. Dr. Chetty down in South Africa, I loved it. I did a 2-hour symposium. It's on Covexit, which is a great platform to learn about COVID-19. He said, listen, there's many ways to treat. I'm going to keep going. They tell me I can't use hydroxy or ivermectin. I'll use something else. He goes, try montelukast. I said, gosh, I haven't tried it. He goes, oh, yeah, it seems to really cut down on some of the cytokine storm. And then we talked about different steroid programs. And he's wonderful. So there's a cocktail, and I have gotten it down. I had a patient the other day in Dallas, primary care doctor, was fighting the patient. No, I'm not going to prescribe hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. We negotiated. The patient ended up getting colchicine, getting prednisone, getting aspirin and Lovenox, and you know what? The patient survived. It was a really critical patient. He was hypoxemic and survived without being hospitalized. So there's so many ways to solve the problem. My point is, be a doctor, work within the constraints that we're in, and we will prevail. You will always be rewarded by helping the patient. And the doctors right now who are practicing therapeutic nihilism, they are denying their patients treatment with the idea that somehow they're right, or they're waiting for more evidence, or they've taken some position of superiority. They do not have the moral high ground. What they're doing is unethical. It's immoral. And in my opinion, it's illegal. It's failure to treat. And their judgment day is coming.
Amen to that.
So
I was going to say, so 2 points you made, which we'll get to, but even our patients who are non-medical kind of wonder what you say about there's something bigger going on where they don't want you to treat, which we'll get to next. But before, I wanted to ask about that. What about if someone has no clue even where to start looking for all these suggestions and options for treatment? So any practicing physicians out there who are listening to us, where would you recommend them to go look to find all these supportive medications and natural
protocols.
Protocols, yeah, there you go.
Like any other emerging problem, there must be at least one medical society or one consortium, something to come forward where there's some agreement. And fortunately, we have that now. There's 2. One is the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, AAPSonline.org, and they have a list of all the treating doctors, all the treating centers in the United States. They have a home treatment guide that lists the protocols that we've talked about. They've been updated over time, nutraceuticals, prescription drugs, what to do, safety and precautions given. It's a wonderful treatment approach. The other is the Frontline Critical Care Consortium, FLCCC. They also have an entire list of treating doctors. They have protocols. They even have great acronyms for them, Math Plus, and they have another one. And the bottom line is, when it comes to early treatment, we accept that there's multiple ways to treat a problem. We accept there's going to be different protocols that arise out of being innovative, using ingenuity. And people said, well, we should just have one protocol. I said, no, we shouldn't. We should be this is wide open right now as doctors learn how to treat this. And I'm glad these 2 organizations have come forward, and really they have educational seminars, they have CME programs, they have patient testimonials, and they're constantly having the doctors stay in communication with one another so we can learn. I learned by spending time with this South African doctor, and fortunately the technology has allowed us to meet each other across the world now, and we're going to learn a lot more about how to treat this problem. The learning is not going to come from our regulatory agencies. The biggest mistake people are doing is sitting saying, listen, I'm going to wait until the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, or the World Health Organization tells me what to do. Since when did we do that? None of those organizations told us how to use blood thinners and stents. We had to figure that out.
Well, all I can say is, wow.
I know. That was amazing. And there's actually so much more to come, because that interview with him, we ended there. And we went on for an hour. We were talking to him for an hour and a half, and it's so, the material's so great. But I mean, what we've talked about already is just mind blowing, because honestly, I mean, I got to the point where I've gave up and lost interest for a while. I'm not in it as deep as you are, because you're right there in the respiratory clinic. But I got to the point where I'm like, I don't care. No one's jazzed about this. No one's talking about treatments. It's like, there's nothing you can do. It's all hospital based. And I felt so pathetic and neutered, because I'm like, this is not usually how we act with anything else that we're doing, like we talked about. I mean, you mentioned the hepatitis, well, how we used to do things. Well, I mean, we do things off label all the time with treatments, that things that are anecdotal that seem to work, that help patients. Just sitting back and doing nothing, it just didn't feel right. And I mean, he's exactly, he's one of those guys, those frontiersmen, kind of just fly by the seat of your pants, like, yeah, we got to do something for our patients. That's the goal, is to putting the patient first and caring for our patients in the best way with all the tools we have possible, not just sitting around waiting.
No, it's really humbling. You talk about physician burnout and all this, but when you see somebody who is unbelievably well-schooled, a true academic, understands how studies work, have been involved in this, has been in academic medicine for, most of his career, but still sees patients, but then brings that intellectual heft
and that passion, like, it's just so contagious and inspiring. I mean, I just felt so refreshed even just having this conversation with them.
Right. It really makes me want to continue being a doctor and not just sell motorcycles or something else. Like, it really is, because that's what medicine's about. Medicine's about the patient first. It's not the administrator first, not the insurance company first. It's the patient first. And Dr. McCullough, in this, the first part of this interview, really reignited my passion, which is, what? It's about it's about the patient, stupid. That's what it's about.
Yep.
It's about us going in there and taking all of these years of training, all of the suffering that we experienced in medical training and staying up at night and, missing parties and all of these things, and focusing it 100% on what matters, which is treating the patient in front of us.
Yep, absolutely.
The doctor-patient relationship is sacred. It's sacred legally because it's sacred. And thank you, Peter McCullough, for teaching us this again. I mean, it stinks that, this horrific world pandemic has to teach that. But, there's heroes out there, and he's absolutely a hero. And I cannot wait for next week's episode, where we unpack, even though I hate the word unpack, even more of this and get into the vaccines and other things. Stay tuned, kids, because the ship has just left the shore, and May has one more word for us.
Yes. Don't cut me off before I remind everybody that we want you to go hang out with our friend Erin Wiseman over at Dr. Me First on your favorite podcast app. Give her a listen. It's a refreshing, totally different take on medicine. It'll also get you jazzed and get the crispy burnout flames of despair off it.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more, and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com. cardiologist.com.